Please don't leave me. The words haunted her. She could still feel the desperation behind them, the begging to not be abandoned again. She had wanted nothing more than to swoop back down and sweep the colorful girl into her arms and vow to her that she would never leave her again. To whisper sweet nothings into her ear and hold her in the enchanted forest, where rabbits roamed and gems glistened. Whilst the magics of Wednesday was able to lure the girl back into her slumber, the wolf within would not submit, and in that enchanted forest, the wolf returned and howled in mourning, in longing, before too lying down in defeat and pining. Wednesday had since decided to return to human form for the night, watching over Enid. She sat perched on the window, her back pressed against the side and right leg draped down, hanging loosely. This wasn't the same demon that had lurked in the window of the master bedroom, ready to deliver a dastardly dose of daggers and decimation. This was a demon who only hours before had realized she was in love with her, a human. Of course, beings like her had fallen in love with humans before, the Watchers being the prime example of those that fallen from grace for humanity. But she wasn't one of them. She was a demon, a twisted, vile inflection of infernal bile. She wasn't mean to love or care or cherish. It was contrary to her nature, a paradox. Even amongst her own kind. And then came the angel, Ishmael. Her brother. She knew he would send him because of their relationship. Out of all those that had remained loyal, he was the one she'd been the closest to back in the earliest day of the Age of Starlight. She had raised him from a fledgling, teaching him how to fly and fight, and now he looked at her the way they all did, like looking upon her would soil their graces. They had sent him to inform her to go back to the abyss. It was a prison for demons as much as it was for evil, unrepentant human souls. Their punishment for not loving humanity was to spend an eternity imprisoned with the worst of the lot. She could at least begrudgingly admire the punishment's irony. But this wasn't the topic at hand. What was she going to do about Ishmael? She knew how their minds worked. He would be back. And he would probably not be alone. They knew how fierce a fighter she was. Especially now she had something to fight for. Her gaze lingered on Enid, who lay on her back, hand above her head, making small sounds every so often, little growls, or dog-like whimpers and yips. Wednesday listened to each one carefully and stored them away in her heart because she simply could not bear to forget a single one. Her adoration for her was infinite. She sighed. Time was now against her. Even without the angelic interference, she knew her time would be limited. Enid was mortal, she was not. Eventually Enid would wither and die, and her soul would move on to where she could not follow. She knew that heartbreak was coming. Whether it be by the ravages of time or a legion of angels. She knew. She knew she would have to spend the rest of eternity alone. It would drive her insane with longing because the supreme authority was not merciful. At least, not to her kind. Humans always got the redemptions as the favorites. It made her want to laugh bitterly. Just like Enid and her mother, God had favorites, and neglected the rest. But she would not rest. She would make sure that by the time she was dragged away back into the pit, Esther Sinclair would be there waiting for her. And maybe ripping her apart would conceal just how much her heart would agonize by not being with her. Enid awoke with a start. Memories came flooding back of a night spent in forest of glowing willows and a pond filled with gemstones, one of an eternal hunt. But that wasn't what she focused on. Even though it was the most vivid of dreams she can ever remember having. Usually some nights were spent in the clutches of her mind's darkest fears and reality. The fact she knew her mother didn't love her. That she was alone. Of course she had her friends at Nevermore. But here? She was well and truly alone. Save for Enigma. Speaking of which, her head turned to look straight at the window. Enigma sat perched on the window she had left open last night. His eyes were closed. She drew the raven plushie to herself in comfort and sighed into it. She remembered, all too clearly, the stranger that had appeared before her in the dream. The dark-haired girl, the very pretty dark-haired girl. Enid felt a small blush on the tip of her nose. She had felt so familiar, so right, so everything. She couldn't place it. Even her wolf could sense that she was immensely familiar, and it too mourned the loss with her in the forest. She involuntarily whined at the memory. Enigma, now fully aware, turned to fix Enid with a stare. "Please don't leave me," she had pleaded as the pretty girl had vanished from sight. It filled her heart with longing. She had felt so attached, like she knew her. But she didn't. It had felt so real, all too real. She made it sit up in her bed, smacking her lips as she did so. She fixed on a smile, and then yawned. "G'morning, Ennig," she said quietly, stretching her arms above her head as she yawned again. She threw the covers off of herself and walked up to the window. The sun was just beginning to arise in the glory of a new day. Enid absent-mindedly reached out to stroke Enigma with her 2 fingers. The bird thrilled happily before there was a sudden flap of wings, and Enid giggled as the raven settled on her shoulder, the strong beat of his wings sending her already tousled hair whipping in multiple directions. She blew a strand of blonde hair away from her face in mock annoyance, but her giggling pointed to otherwise. "Thanks, Enigma, great job," she laughed, giving the bird a mock thumbs up. The bird thrilled in response. Enid shook her head. "I swear you are more intelligent than you let on." Stifling a yawn, she started to pad her way downstairs, dragging her feet as she did so. She reached the ground floor and quietly entered the kitchen. Enigma the raven was still perched on her shoulder. The Sinclair clan glanced up at the new arrival. Her 2 brothers, Noah and James, briefly gave her small smiles before tucking back into their own breakfasts. Murray gave his youngest daughter a small, comforting smile that she only half-heartedly returned. This was her family, but the abuse that he allowed her mother to commit against her soured him somewhat in her eyes. She still loved her father, of course, but still, the point remained. Enigma had become a common sight in the Sinclair household. Enid had posted both videos to TikTok and Instagram of the bird in question. And as werewolves, they all knew the inclinations that ravens had to wolves in the wild. It didn't surprise Murray that one had found and bonded with his youngest, as ravens tended towards the pups the most. Esther turned round, plate of bacon, eggs and toast in one hand, ready to set it down in front of Enid when she spotted Enigma. She stopped, eyes wide in terror, because she knew this was Wednesday, perched on the shoulder of the daughter she once abused. The demon that had been torturing her every night. The raven's beady black eyes glared down at her as she sat down, placing the food in front of Enid, who happily tucked into her meal, none the wiser. Esther watched with bated breath as Enigma's soulless black eyes bore into hers. It could see the fear laced in hers, and then the bird cocked its head to glance at the 2 of the brothers, oblivious to the world around them. Esther's eyes widened as the raven's face contorted into that malicious grin with a sharpened beak. Its meaning was clear, and Esther was terrified. If the demon wanted Enid, it could have her. She was a runt. The only reason she was still here was because she was under 18 and was her legal obligation. The law was slightly different for werewolf packs, as runts used to be discarded and left to die in the gutter due to the shame of having bore one to term. They were the shame of any pack. Some alpha wolves would go as so far to rip runts to pieces to keep the genetic lines pure. That was until normie laws were secretly legislated for the outcast world. Despite what some outcasts tended to believe, the regular governments had made sure to give the outcasts their own laws in addition to human ones, to account for their additional abilities. Like the sirens having their necklaces, keeping their songs suppressed to keep both the normie world and the outcasts safe. Some saw it as oppression, and some saw it as necessary. Esther's abuse made that clear, hoping that her actions would unleash the wolf from within, but it only seemed to make it shrink further back into itself. It's how she tried to justify herself abusing her youngest daughter. She could not let this demon harm her sons, who were destined to be alphas of their own packs one day, keeping their werewolf genes strong and virile. And most importantly, pure. Her gaze settled on her youngest daughter as she ate. Her eyes would have narrowed in contempt, except the raven was there. Her fingers itched, and anger boiled under her skin. This runt was the whole reason their pack was at the bottom of the pecking order. Her family line went back several hundred years, for it all to be torn down by a singular runt. Murray was the only reason why the girls still had anything to do with their family outside of the law's requirement to cater and look after her basic needs for food and shelter. Esther vowed that this monster would not harm her boys. Almost seemingly sensing her train of thought, Wednesday Enigma gazed back to Esther and into her very core. She knew on some level the raven had sensed her intent. She stared right back, looking braver than she felt. "Hey Enig, try this!" Enigma looked away and down at Enid's fingers, holding a small piece of bacon. The bird leaned forward on its perch, sniffing it before carefully accepting the food into its mouth. The bird swallowed and let out a sort of happy caw. Enid giggled and held up another offering, which the bird happily devoured. If there was one thing these humans got right, it was bacon. Wednesday mused as she happily accepted the 4th piece of bacon Enid was currently feeding her. Every little giggle sent her heart aflutter. She'd murder hundreds just to hear it again. if that is what it took. Emotions were rolling off of Esther in waves, which Wednesday could feel. Despite how impressively stoic the mother's composure was, she could feel the vibration of her feelings, and what she felt there enraged her. Hatred. Utter, complete hatred. But not for her. It was for the colorful girl whose shoulder she was perched on. She would deal with that later, when she could, because right now, Enid deserved some peace until she returned to Nevermore, which just happened to be in a few days. Apparently a letter had come that very morning saying that students were free to return to Nevermore at the start of the week. And Enid, desperate to get away from her mother, readily replied via text she would be there. Her mother, just as eager, made no complaint. She smirked to herself. Esther was revealing to her all her weaknesses, and she didn't even know it. Wednesday watched as Esther bestowed motherly affection on her two boys, Enid's brothers. Brothers, that she noted with cold fury, that never intervened on their little sister's behalf, a responsibility that they had failed in their little sister. Even the angels, her own brothers and sisters, protected each other, and she would protect them, and she hated their guts. And so Wednesday put into motion her plan. If she lost her cool, though, Enid would be without a brother. The day had passed in a blur, mostly with her watching Enid pack her things ready for the train to Nevermore the next evening. She noted with fondness how carefully the raven plushie was placed next to the pigeon plushie in her case. "I'm going to miss you, Enigma," she said, sadly stroking the bird fondly. "I will be with you soon enough, my wolf." Enigma let out a sad caw as Enid smiled sadly at the bird. "I wouldn't have got through the summer without you, little guy," scratching the bird under the chin like she would a cat. "I am a demoness, you multicolored, vibrant, walking disaster," Wednesday thought grumpily. God, she was going domestic at this rate. But as Enid settled into her slumber for the night, Wednesday watched over her with her own mind set to its task. It was time. Wednesday's magic settled over Enid as they did every night, allowing her to sink into the dreamscape, her wolf roaming free in the enchanted forest. Enid sighed with happiness. Sinking deeper into her slumber, Wednesday stood over her sleeping form, a dark and avenging guardian angel. "Sleep, Mia Lupa, sleep," she softly, finger brushing blonde hair away from her face. Enid's body tried to chase Wednesday's comforting touch, but the magics were too strong, embracing her in its grace and luring her back to forest of bioluminescence. Wednesday turned her gaze upwards and scowled. Moving like a gliding shadow, she approached one of the brothers' bedrooms. Frankly, she didn't care to learn either of their names. Her foot lashed out, the door flew inwards, sending splinters of wood everywhere. James woke with a terrified start as the 5 feet 1 inch tall demon stood passively in the doorway, knife by her side. James' claws extended as he eyed the threat. "You won't need those," Wednesday taunted. With a wave of a finger, the claws were suddenly forcibly retracted. James screamed at the sudden pain. The demon stalked over to the bed. "You're coming with me, boy," James whimpered, as a child would, as Wednesday grabbed him roughly by the hair and dragged him upstairs. "Oh, Esther," Wednesday called out with a sing-song voice. "Oh, Esther." She climbed deliberately, slowly, making sure every footstep thundered on every step, her knife embedded in the wall to her right, allowing her demonic strength to tear into it, leaving a jagged cut through masonry. Wednesday's smile never left her as she sent the door flying off the hinges with telekinesis. Murray and the other brother were submerged in their own nightmares by her magics. They would not be able to interfere. She tossed James in front of her. "Mom!" he cried. "Silence, boy," she commanded, and his lips were suddenly forced shut, leaving him to whimper. "You never learn, Esther," Wednesday seethed, baring her teeth. "I sense your contempt for your own daughter today." Her eyes narrowed. "You really would have let an alpha rip her apart without a second thought, wouldn't you?" Esther stood up, nose held up high. "That's what runts like her deserve. She is an embarrassment. She dishonors the clan." Esther spat back. "Mom?" James spoke with confusion, his eyes darting back and forth between her and Wednesday. "It's Enid, Mom. How can you dash?" "Quiet, James," Esther hissed. "Don't speak about things you know nothing about. You need not worry, whore. When the time comes, I will take Enid away from here, and I will bestow her with affection the world of which has never seen." Esther scoffed. "But today? Today is the day you learn what it looks like to lose a child, the greatest torture of all." Esther paled as she finally noticed the blade in Wednesday's hand. A blade of silver. Esther screamed, James broke down in sobs, and Wednesday laughed. It was cruel and merciless. She raised the silver blade and pressed it to James' neck. It made her feel so alive. She dug the blade further into his neck, ready to slit his throat. The silver would render him mortal and he would bleed out, right in front of her. All it would take is to run the sharpened edge across his throat. His blue eyes looked up at his killer, his murderer. He would never find a mate, or have pups, or have a family, or find peace. His blue eyes blinked. "Tell Enid I'm sorry," he choked out. She stared down into his eyes. Her hands stilled. His blue eyes awash with unshed tears. Enid's blue eyes. Wednesday's hand faltered, fingers losing their grip, their confidence. He had Enid's eyes. She couldn't do it. The blade clattered to the floor. Her grip loosened and James scrambled away from his would-be killer. Esther sobbed in relief as she brought James into her arms, shushing the boy as the 18-year-old cried into her shoulder, as she cradled his head. She had seen it in his eyes, those fucking eyes, the regret, the fear. Those had been with his last moments, and he used them to ask forgiveness from his sister. It touched Wednesday in a way she couldn't understand. "Go back downstairs," she growled out at James. With a final hug and kiss on the head, James carefully moved around the demon who glowered at him unblinkingly, his retreating footsteps reaching her ears. The boy didn't question how his door was fully fixed as he climbed back into bed, Wednesday's magic luring him to a deep sleep. "Thank you," Esther whispered. Wednesday's face darkened. "I didn't do it for you," she hissed. Her hand reached out and the silver blade flew back into her grasp. Wednesday spun on her heel to leave the room. She turned back to look the matriarch in the eyes, nothing happily they were brown and not like her daughter's. "One day, I will take Enid from here forever, and when I do, you shall do nothing." Esther nodded her head. "I spared him for her, I will not spare you." Wednesday waved her hand and everything began to repair itself as she made her to Enid's room. She looked down upon Enid and felt a longing for her that ebbed away at her, knowing the next few days would be difficult. "I will see you soon, Enid," she murmured. Her body formed into Enigma the Raven. She launched her body away from the Wenclair household. And as the Raven flew west to New Jersey, her magics began to wane the further she went. As they fully retreated, a single tear raced down Enid's cheek. Wednesday had arrived the next day's evening at the Adams mansion. Morticia, usually a calm individual, was seething with anger. Pacing up and down, Wednesday walked up to her and questioned her, a real mother, a caring mother, a loving mother. What was wrong? "It's Pugsley," she said. "It's only been a day since he returned to school for the semester, and he's already being bullied by his peers. The school refuses to do anything about it." Wednesday listened and felt that familiar anger boil inside her. "Enroll me there, I will deal with the vermin." Wednesday turned away, intent on spending time in solitude. "What about Nevermore, my little viper?" Morticia asked. Wednesday paused in her stride, thinking of Enid, who was currently traveling west to Vermont, to Nevermore. "Nevermore can wait." The words pierced deeper than she would ever imagine. "I have bullies to deal with." She continued her stride. "As you wish, our little death trap." Morticia smiled. They would make a true Adams out of her yet. Everything worked out just as they planned, with a few fake documents here and a few fake testimonies there, and a very real, very deadly incident of Wednesday dropping a school of piranha into a high school's swimming pool. Fools! Red-bellied piranha only go into a feeding frenzy when potential prey thrashed around in a panic, and boy, did they panic. And so she found herself in the hearse with her parents and Pugsley as they traveled up the road to Nevermore, to Enid. Was she nervous? Yes. Was she scared? Hell yes. Her head swiveled around as they traversed the school to her new dorm. Principal Weems was talking about the history of Nevermore and its status as a haven for all outcasts. Wednesday was happy to note that the students here did look happy. She may be a demon, but the angel in her was content to see good people be safe and cared for. However, she felt her heart sink in disappointment as she failed to spot the bubbly blonde in any way. Her mind raced. Had Enid even left home? Had Esther done something? Wednesday was fully prepared to murder the bitch at a moment's notice. Gomez and Morticia quickly noticed Wednesday's increasingly sour mood. They too kept an eye out for Enid, despite not knowing what she looked like, only a description. Weems marched forwards and grasped the handle to the door to her new room. She marched through with Wednesday scowling behind her. The first thing she noticed was the explosion of color. "It's so vivid," Gomez couldn't help but utter as he too gazed in partial horror at the kaleidoscope of a room. Weems just beamed a smile in response. Wednesday's eyes trailed down to the girl sitting at her laptop. Oh. Oh. Before Wednesday's thoughts could even catch up to her racing heart, the girl was moving. The girl bounded up to them with an adorable run, hands fanned out at her sides. "Howdy, Rumi!" the blonde uttered. Her face flushed and full of life. She was here. Her heart stopped, she just couldn't breathe. "That was fine though, right? Wednesday, this is Enid Sinclair." And the first words that Enid found herself thinking as her eyes met with the darkened brown of Wednesday's. "Pretty goth girl,"